Right, I'm going to read some from chapter 1 and then a small part from chapter 14. Daniel Flynn looked around at the magnificent warehouses, grown tall around the dock. They must have been higher than the trees around Loch Lean, higher than he could have imagined until he saw them. Whilst they displayed a majesty all their own, they shared none of the sweet meadow smell. Daniel found the noise and bustle oppressive. He swallowed hard. He had no idea what to do. He was 7 years old and arriving in a strange land alone. He shuddered. He was used to the single-storey, tumble-down cottages scattered around the lanes, not these huge buildings of brick and timber, piled ramshackle as far as his eyes could see. "You fetid lumps of bog rot, go back to where you came from." A man in plaid trousers and a bright, well-tailored jacket, with an accent as alien as the buildings, hurled insults at the hundreds of starving Irish families descending from the ship. Shoulders dropped, Daniel drew his rag-wrapped belongings closer to the tiny frame of his beleaguered body. He walked a few faltering steps before looking back at the open expanse of rigging against the cloudless sky. The view belied the cramped conditions he had suffered below deck. Then, with his head bowed, he moved forward onto the quay. Through the gaps in the planking, he could see excrement floating on the surface of the water, while the stench of rotting life filled the air. He was immune to the smell. Rot had dogged his life so far. You'd go a long way to find a worse odour than the fields of rotting potatoes, black-stalked and grey-slimed, decayed with blight, which marked the early years of his life. After that, it was disease which filled the air. He thought setting sail for America would mean fresh sea air to breathe, but he reckoned without conditions on board ship. 7 weeks of waste, seasickness and death had left him wishing he were back amongst the yellow-flowered fields of Killarney, where he had loved to wander, escaping from the decay. A dark-suited figure, with a neat-trimmed but extensive beard, approached him. "Bread, soup, and make sure your mammy and daddy vote for Kelly." Daniel readily took the offered food, hoping his luck was starting to change. "Move along, young man." "Please, sir, I ain't got no mammy and daddy no more." Daniel looked up with pleading eyes into the kindly face. But the politician transferred his insincere benevolence to the next person coming off the boat, and the next, onward down the line of hungry, destitute countrymen from Cork and Kerry. It wasn't supposed to be this way. He was accustomed to the hunger. God knew he'd felt it long enough. He savoured the soup as he dipped the bread and drank the sops. He ate quickly, eyes darting around lest someone should take it from him. Compared to the last few weeks, the food was fit for a king. He imagined his Uncle Seamus wagering that not many kings ventured onto the wharf. Uncle Seamus would have wagered on the date of his own wake, if he'd had anything left to wager with. For a moment, Daniel almost smiled, until he remembered how far away his uncle was now. They'd left the dockside of Cork a hopeful family, having journeyed from their native Killarney, desperate to find a better life. That's what his da had said. A land of opportunity was what the great Michael Flynn told his wife and son. Their landlord helped with the passage. He was a generous man whose land could no longer support them. "Now don't you go forgetting the goodness of Mr. O'Connor there, Daniel. Don't you go forgetting." His da was insistent they showed what gratitude they could when so many of their neighbours were left to the mercy of the poorhouse, forced to give up what little land they had in their desperate need of alms. With both his parents dispatched to watery graves, New York was now an opportunity Daniel Flynn faced alone. Weakened by years of famine, his ma and da hadn't the strength to overcome seasickness and the diseases on board ship. Within 5 days of each other they died, while he watched in helpless horror. First his mother, and then his broken-hearted father, lost without his childhood sweetheart, were taken from him, leaving Daniel with no one to rely on but himself. Back home, there'd have been family to take him in, but not here. It would have been a starving family, but it was family nonetheless. On board ship, it was every man, woman, and child for themselves, and with barely enough to feed their own families, no one was going to give preference to someone else's boy. He took a deep breath, blinking back the tears, and did the only thing he'd been able to sustain himself with over the last days and nights, singing the ballads of home that his father had sung. He sat on a wooden crate, closed his eyes and sang, imagining his Da might be there to hear him, and wishing it were so. Daniel's nasal intonation mimicked his father to perfection, but he possessed no more idea of where Kilmore was than of the layout of New York. As he sang the beautiful words of his homeland, he clung to his small bundle of belongings, barely aware of the crowd gathering around him, or the half-pennies and pennies being thrown at his feet. For a few precious moments, Daniel could believe he was back in Ireland with his family, with his father singing, and his Uncle Patrick's fingers dancing their own jig across the strings of the fiddle. It was only when the suited figure's voice broke over the music to move the crowd along that Daniel once more became aware of his surroundings, and of a scruffy figure, lanky for his young age, scooping up the coins in front of him. Daniel sized him up, probably a year or two more than he was, but with a streetwise edge, which to Daniel made him seem older. "Ain't you going to stop me? I'm easy to spot with this mop." The boy laughed, pointing to his flame-red corkscrew curls, defying control under his weather-beaten hat. "Stop you what?" Daniel asked, wide-eyed. "Nicking your money." "What money? I don't have any money." "You're good, you are." "What money?" "I don't have any money." "I likes that. Folks liked your singing. I guess it reminded them of home. What others do you know?" "All the ones my da used to sing." "I'm Tom," said the boy, holding the coins out in his hand to Daniel, "and these, I believe, are yours." Daniel blinked, taking the coins from Tom's hand and looking at their strangeness. He closed his fist around the money and held tight. "Tom." "Thomas H. Riley, pickpocket extraordinaire at your service." Tom stood, took a sweeping bow, and then opened his hand to reveal a pocket watch, a locket, and a pair of gold cufflinks. "That little crowd you drew proved quite good pickings. It don't cost me much to let you have the coins they threw. We should do it again sometime. Maybe not on the waterfront, where we're likely to be seen, though. Where are you staying?" Daniel bit his lip and shrugged. "I dunno. I don't rightly know anything, except I'm Daniel Flynn from Killarney." He smiled as he thrust his hand out to shake Tom's hand, and waited while Tom put his treasure store back into his trouser pocket, before he could reciprocate. A feeling of relief flooded through Daniel. For the first time in 3 weeks, he didn't feel completely alone. "You'd best come with me," Tom said, offering to take Daniel's bundle. "It's fine." Daniel clutched his belongings. "I ain't going to nick it. Anyways, come and meet me ma. Where we live it ain't much, but it's a roof. Though you gets wet when it rains, it's not as bad as some." He walked on across the cobbled street. "That there's old Tinker. He's one from the old country. He ain't so bad." Tom grabbed Daniel's arm and pulled him behind a barrel at the front of an alleyway. He pointed to a man with curled moustache, dressed well in bright suiting and carrying a cane. "We owes him," he whispered. "He's our landlord, or leastways the one who collects the rent. May as well be the same thing for the difference it makes to us. If Ma says you can stay, maybe them coins could help us pay." Daniel stared at the man passing the alley, his head held high, a handkerchief clasped over his nose with his left hand, leaving the extensive grey whiskers curling out at the side. Daniel nodded to Tom, holding out the coins whose value meant little without the security of a family. "Not yet. We'll talk to Ma." They moved away from the barrel and onwards along Pearl Street. Further along, Tom hesitated, shot dancing glances over his shoulders, and then guided Daniel through a narrow doorway into a rickety warehouse piled high with wooden crates. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust to the gloom as Tom led him to an uneven staircase with as many gaps as remaining steps to negotiate in order to reach the floor above without incident. Dan opened his mouth, but Tom held his finger to his lips. Daniel nodded. Tom placed a hand on his shoulder, preventing him moving forward along the landing, and Daniel nodded again. Tom walked on into the darkness of the building, almost dancing with an experienced step around the rotten planking. Once he was out of sight, Daniel strained his ears to hear what was happening. There was the sound of a nervous cough and then silence. After a few moments, he could hear a number of metal objects, including a chain, being laid down. Daniel presumed it was the afternoon's pickings. No words passed. He heard the items being drawn across a tabletop, and then once more there was nothing. Moments later, Tom returned, walking straight past Daniel, his jaw thrust forward in defiance. Tom headed down the staircase, and Daniel struggled to follow him. As he disappeared into the street, Daniel ran to catch him up. "They was gold, to be sure they was." "Cufflinks?" Daniel asked, not knowing what else to say. "I knows gold when I sees it. I should do by now." Tom spat in the gutter. "And them was gold. You should have seen the bloke wearing 'em." He stopped and leaned back against a wooden strut supporting the overhanging awning to a saloon bar, and let out a deep sigh. A scrawny, flea-ridden dog ran past, sniffing them as he went. "It's different if you're in the gangs. You get better prices then. But that ain't for us. We're no daybreak boys. Pickpocketing's one thing, but I don't fancy killing no one." He kicked the toe of his oversized boot in the dirt. "We've got each other now, you and me. We'll be all right." Tom punched Daniel's arm. "I'll race you to the corner." Daniel felt the warm thrill of acceptance as he picked up speed to catch Tom, but Tom's longer legs made it easier for him to get away. Daniel didn't see Tom stop in front of him, and he went careering into his friend, landing them both in a tangled heap in the dirt. A small girl carrying a jug came and stood over them. "Now what are you doing down there, Thomas Riley?" Daniel couldn't help but laugh to hear a girl, so obviously younger than he was, tearing a strip off his new friend. "Hey, Molly, we've got a visitor." The girl looked at Daniel for the first time, and her face broke into a smile. "So if I know our Thomas, he'll be blaming you for rolling around in the dirt." "It was my fault." Daniel wanted to hold the gaze of this girl for as long as he could. He smiled back, admiring her long brown curls, pinned back under a once white cloth bonnet. Tom brushed dirt off his hands as he got up. "This is me kid sister Molly. She's all right for a girl." He laughed and gave her an affectionate jostle. "Careful, mind. Don't make me spill the grog. What'll Mammy say?" "She's a chip off the old block, is our Molly." Tom put a hand down to pull Daniel up from where he was still sitting, gaping at Molly. They walked another few yards along the road, ducking under the lines of drying rags which crisscrossed the alleyway, until Tom nodded as he approached a tumble-down shed. It was little more than a wooden frame, leaning against the side of a stable. A horse whinnied from the other side of the boarding and then pawed the ground with its hoof. Straw scattered from the stable doorway onto the street. "This is it, then." Tom stood back with a flourish, allowing Molly to pass through the entrance. "So that I've taken you up to where you've met the three key characters that will go on to be the friends that you will meet through the rest of the story. And then moving on to a brief bit from chapter 14. Daniel walked on towards the town. There was precious little time until the sun would start to rise, and already the darkness had lost its hard edge. He'd heard a train away to his right. He would have to cross the main dirt road into town to get there, but it was still early enough, he hoped, for that not to cause a problem. He waited alongside the irrigation ditch at the edge of the field and listened. The sinister chirrups and rustles of the night creatures were all that disturbed the peace. He smiled. Chirrups were good. It was silence he needed to fear. Slowly, so as not to raise his heart rate, he made his way over the dirt track and across the ditch on the other side. This was land he was not familiar with, and he reached out carefully to feel the line of the crop and checked what obstacles confronted him. He was relieved to find more corn. He needed to make his way through the crop towards the far side of the field. He hoped the farmhands here could sow in a straight line. He reached forward into the darkness to feel his way through the high stalks that grew to either side. If the wildlife would forgive his intrusion, at least the corn would give him cover a while. Before he'd finished crossing the field, he could see the corn well enough without use of his hands, and wove his way onwards, hoping the railroad wasn't much further. It was too light to come out into the open, within sight of the town, but maybe if the yard were deserted, he'd still be able to break cover and make it to a wagon. He was contemplating this when he felt the earth vibrating slightly, and he shuddered, and the happy knowledge that he was nearer to the tracks than he'd realised. The thought gave him energy, and he walked a little faster. Now that just gives you a little taste of what Daniel is in a situation where he's having to run from something, but I'm not going to tell you any more about what he was running from.